Hello, I'm Fleshtrap, and I'm the project lead over at Devlog. Today, we're going to be going over our first ever tutorial. However, I don't know exactly what to make the tutorial on, so, I don't know. Yeah? Oh.
Oh, pick up the phone. Pick up the phone.
What's up? Alright.
It's like this thing.
Hold on, I'll call you right back. I think I know what today's tutorial is going to be on. I think today we should go over headlights, basically how to attach like a flashlight to your head in Rec Room. I think this is great for horror experiences and more, and I think this will definitely be a good understanding of quaternions, vector 3s, and delta time. And with that, let's get into it. Anyways, to quickly go over what we're going to be talking about today, I thought I'd show you this little example. So, this is pretty much just a general execution, but we're going to be clicking this button, and notice how that flashlight follows along and it has that little like delay behind it to make it a little more cinematic. Might be a little hard to see, but hopefully it's not too hard to see. If I'm being honest with you, I think I could best teach this lesson in two separate parts: the execution side of things and the data of which. Anyways, we're going to be teaching how to do that today, but first, of course, we're going to need to get rid of all of this. So anyways, with that, crazy. Alright, let's get into our material. I think it's only right if we start out with the execution side of things, because that's a little easier to, understand and such. First of all, you're going to start out by getting your maker pen. You can do this in several different ways, as you may know, but one, that's probably my favorite, is favoriting it on your backpack menu in your watch, and pulling it out of your back just like that. Once we get our maker pen, we're going to go into it, click Tools, make sure we're on Create. I'm going to change my snapping to Surface, that way everything's more streamlined. Now, let's go to Palette, click the search icon, and we're going to grab a button. So let's just spawn that in. And of course you can replace it with any general execution, however, just for this tutorial I think it's best to use a button. Next, we're going to go back into our maker pen, and we're going to get 3 more chips. The bool variable, a knot, and a player variable. We're going to go back to our tools menu and click connect and or wire if you're in rooms 2.0. But because we're in rooms 1.0, we're going to click connect. We're going to wire the pressed of the button to the input of the bool variable and keep that execution chugging along, and it will go straight into the player variable. Next, we're going to kind of crisscross the knot in the bool variable here and connect the player of the player variable to the player that clicked the button. This way we can optimize this for multiplayer. The reason why I have it leading into a bool variable and a player variable is because for the player variable, we need to know who exactly will have the flashlight attached to them. And then for the bool variable, this will be our toggle to turn it on and off, thus keeping it following us or not following us. One very important fact though, if you're optimizing for multiplayer, is configuring the player variable and making sure it is synced. That way the player is the same for everybody and it's not running off of one device locally. Anyways, now to the second half of our executions, you're going to go into your palette again, you're going to click your search bar, and then we're going to search for the event receiver, right there, a delay, an if, and only a few more. We're going to get, I'm going to search up valid and if player is valid and local. This one's pretty important. Only 2 more. We're going to spawn in a rec room object take authority. Oh, there we go. And then finally, we're going to get a set transform. Good work. I'm just going to do a little bit of organizing here. Just make sure everything is moved in together. We're going to get our wire tool, or connect. And then we're going to wire the input of the event receiver to the delay, the after delay to the if, the then of the if to the if player is valid and local, and if the player is both valid and local, it'll take the object authority, and after that, set the position and rotation, thus setting the transfer. I don't know. However, before we get anywhere else, make sure to configure with the tools menu your event receiver and make sure it is set to update. Remember, not 1 Hz, not 30 Hz, update. Just like that. And then make sure you configure your delay to 1 second. Anyways, what this is doing is, I will get into what an event receiver update is, however, it will ping as many times as possible into this delay, and then into the if. The if is how we will use the toggle factor, and this is how we make sure this player will exist. Speaking of which, connect right there. It'll make sure to take the authority, that way it's running off of this player's device and not any others, and then it will set the position and the rotation of the object. And then, to bring our toggle pretty much full circle, we're going to need to connect that if to the output of the bool variable. What will happen now is it will only do all of this if that is true, and if it's false, of course it will not. However, we are missing one big piece of the executions, and this is the final thing we will need. That being a spotlight. Here are some settings I recommend for this tutorial, because they honestly just make everything a bit better. We're going to go to our intensity, make it 15. This is basically how strong the light is, so if you turn it up you can see it gets much brighter, and if it goes down, of course it gets more dim. So I recommend 15. The range, of course, is how far it will go. So if I move it back here, if the range is super short, it will not show, but if it's super long, then it will show. I recommend setting your range to 250. The specular contribution is pretty much the, reflectivity, I believe is the word, or how reflective the light is. For example, you see how this wood right here, I gotta get a better example. It's like super shiny and such. That's specular contribution. But if you look at it from this side, of course, in the shadow, it's much more dull. I recommend setting specular contribution to 0.75. The angle is pretty much how wide the light is. Notice how it's like this, and then when we turn it all the way up, it's much wider. However, it gets more streamlined whenever you turn it down. For this, I honestly would recommend going to 60. And just for general optimization tips, configure the object board, this little circuit that comes with it, to detached on the Rec Room object mode. That way this circuit board doesn't follow it around. And then delete all board content. There we go. That saves circuits and it helps optimize your games just a little bit more. I will move this right here and then connect specifically the spotlight to the object we're taking the authority of. It'll also be the target of the set transform because it is the object that we will be moving around and such. Anyways, great work on all that if you're following along. That is all of the execution stuff we will be worrying about today. Now on to the harder part, the data side of things. To start off, go into your Maker Pen, go back to your Create tool, go to the palette, and this time you will search for Get Rotation. I'll put this right here. Slurp. By the way, I love how they've done that for the slurp. It's really funny how they've done the also a rare but refreshing beverage. Wonder what they're talking about. We're gonna place that down, of course. And then we are going to need a quaternion create look right there. A multiply chip. And then we're going to look up player head. And we're going to need 3 chips. Player head position, player head up vector, and then player head forward vector. Just gonna move them around a little bit. Anyways, let's get to wiring. First of all, we're going to connect the up vector and the forward vector and the head position. All of those chips that surround a specific player, those are going into the player variable. The quaternion create look has 2 inputs, a forwards and an upwards. We also have a forwards and an upwards for the player head vectors. However, instead of following the rules here, we're going to swap them around a little bit. The forward vector will be the upwards, and the forward of the quaternion create look will be the up vector of the player's head. Finally, we will get the rotation of the spotlight and hook that up to the start of the slurp, and then the quaternion create look to the end of the slurp. The player head position will go into the position of the set transform, and the slurp will go into rotation of set transform. Now, finally, I know I said finally last time, however there's one more step. Putting the input of the multiply to the progress of the slurp, and putting the value of the multiply, it can be any, the bottom or top value, into the update of the event, into the delta time of the event receiver. Next, multiply it by velocity, which I recommend going to either 5 or you can also use 6. I personally go with 6 because it's much more responsive feeling. However, you will make this number farther up if you want it to be more responsive, and lower down if you want it to be slower. This is pretty much the entire system. However, I think it is really important to actually understand all of this data stuff. These ones are obvious. We're getting the rotation of the spotlight, we're getting the position of the player's head. However, what are these 3 chips doing? And what is delta time? I think we should start with delta time, because delta time is pretty unique in the way that it actually relies on the player's frame rate in Rec Room. I made a little diagram here for this, as you can see, where with these 3 chips, update 30 Hz, and update 1 Hz, you can utilize delta time in several different ways. But first you need to understand what it is. For example, say this clock here, made by a good friend of mine, Redo the creator. Say this clock here is encapsulating a second, and these blue arrows are frames in your device. You're getting 1 frame here and another frame this far in the second, which would be a pretty low frame rate, but that's not my point. This time in between frame 1 and frame 2 is your delta time. However, it's specifically your delta time for an update event receiver. The delta time of an update event receiver is the time in between frames on your device. You can calculate for this too if you use this formula. 1 divided by f when f equals frames per second. So if you have 100 frames per second, divide that by 1 and you would get 0.001 if I'm correct. It's just about the update event receiver. The update event receiver relies completely on frame rate. However, 30 Hz and 1 Hz are a different story. An event receiver set to update 30 Hz is pretty much going to aim to trigger 30 times in a second. You can use the formula again, except replace f with t equaling the target Hz. If you're unfamiliar, Hz are pretty much frames, essentially. But getting 1 divided by 30 for an update 30 Hz would pretty much be... I hope you got that right. I'm sorry I didn't even ask, but it would be 0.03, because that's 1 divided by 30. Its goal is to send a ping every frame, but only maximize it to 30 frames throughout the entire second. Can you guess what an event receiver 1 Hz does? Well, here's a hint in case you don't. Remember, use this formula of 1 divided by the target hertz. And remember, it would only ping how many times per second? It's time for the big reveal. 1 time per second. And you can tell that because the delta time is 1, because the time in between ticks is 1 second. Or at least trying to be. Remember, delta time isn't exact, but that's not because it's wrong, it's because it's like too exact, if that makes sense. Because remember, this is getting the exact time it can ping within that frame. If that doesn't make sense, go back to our diagram here and say these are 2 frames. Your frame might not always line up with that directly 1 second interval, so it goes to the nearest one it can, if that makes sense. And now that you get that, how about the up vector and forward vector? What even are those? I have yet another silly diagram here, where we have the green arrow replicating the forward vector and the red arrow indicating the up vector. The forward vector is basically where your player is facing. So if I was facing this way, my forward vector would be facing, of course, that way. The up vector is relative to the position along with the forward vector. The up vector is pretty much your player's head, and then it just goes up relative to the position. So basically, if I look completely straight, the up vector will be completely vertical. However, if I look down, it will be that way. Pretty much imagine you put like a pipe on something, and then you had that something and moved it to the side, and of course the pipe would move along with it, if that makes sense. And the quaternion create look is pretty much just compacting those 2 pieces of data into a quaternion value. And finally, what's a slurp? I love that name. A slurp has 2 values, the start and the end, and then the third being a progress value. In our case, the start and end are quaternion values, which are pretty much rotational data. You could also use vector 3s, which are positional data, and you can use numbers and so on and so forth. But this blue arrow right here is meant to indicate the progress. If we were to delete this multiply and set it to, and set it to, say, 0.1, using 0.1 is actually pretty similar to what we're doing here with this diagram, because in a range where 0 is start and 1 is end, 0.1 throughout that way would be about right here. However, it's important to note that if it were like this, it would work normal for me. However, for a player on a lower end device, say like a MetaQuest headset or their phone or something like that, it doesn't matter the device, but if you have a lower frame rate, it'll run completely differently. I am running a pretty decent FPS right now. For example, I'll just go with 60, and say there's a MetaQuest user or a phone user or any of the sort on a device that's running 20 frames per second. My 60 frames can compute that 0.1 scale 60 times within a second, making it look smooth and quick for me. However, for someone with only 20 of those pings per second, it'll go here, then here, then here, then here, and then it'll just slow down a whole lot more, if that makes sense. There's definitely better ways to explain delta time. I'm not the best at this. This is my first tutorial. So I highly recommend looking up some tutorials on it, because I promise it is something useful to learn. But the reason we're not doing that 0.1 and using the multiply is because we're basically referencing our delta time and or our frames to adapt and have it be the same for everyone. This way, someone with lower frames will have the same experience as someone with higher frames because it's referencing delta time and not a base set value like 0.1, if that makes sense. Anyways, obviously you can organize it a whole lot better. I'm just trying to demonstrate here. But anyways, you can test it out by clicking your button. Whoa, look at that. In this tutorial, I made it where if you look to one side and look to the other, it will kind of like follow along to make it a little more cinematic, and this also looks really good on screen mode. However, say you wanted to get rid of that smoothing, you would just get rid of the lerp entirely, use the quaternion create look, and set that to the rotational data. Then it will follow along perfectly without any delay or cinematic effect or anything. But personally, I think the slurp looks better. Before we end off, you may notice that when you look in the palette for the slurp, you will also find stuff about a lerp. A lerp is a linear interpolation, and a slurp is a spherical linear interpolation. The reason we're using a slurp over a lerp is because lerps are better for positional data, and a slurp is better for rotational data because it's spherical. Remember, we're doing rotations here. If you use your rotate tool on the maker pen and click off or whatever you want to do, you grab a point. Notice how it's a circle. Things rotate on a circular axis. That's pretty much how rotations work. Which is why, personally, I think it's best to use a slurp over a lerp in this case. If you are following along or not and just trying to learn something new, I hope I could bring a new set of skills to your palette. I hope you could maybe learn something new about vectors, quaternions, slurps, whatever. I hope something new came to you in this tutorial. Speaking of tutorials, however, I should probably thank the person that gave me this idea. Our friend Dave. So let me send him our system really quick. That way maybe he can get out of the situation he's in. Whatever that is.
Yo, thank you for the flashlight thing. Oh, this is sick. Alright, so, for context, I found this mysterious square in the forest. I don't know what's going on. Yo, picnic tables! Alright. But what's this? What the? What? Oh, hold on. What the? What the? What the? Where am I? What the hell? What the flip? What the flip? What the? Alright, I'll have to record this later. I gotta get back up there.
Anyways, thanks for watching. I really appreciate you watching the video, and I genuinely hope you learned something new. I tried to make this one a little sillier than the others. But anyways, this has been my first ever tutorial, and I can't wait to see you in more. Anyways, thanks for watching, have a good one, and goodbye!